This lecture will look at the rise of imperial Rome, the first emperor, and the Pax Romana, a period of nearly 200 years where we find a very prosperous Rome building massive monuments across their new empire. Specifically, we will look at the Julio-Claudian family and the Flavians, who are going to take over after them. Republican Rome, where we left off, is established and organized logistically as a large city-state, where the form of government is really an oligarchy controlled by a senate, or a series of rich or wealthy families, like the Julii family, for instance, the Colonna and other wealthy families, will be controlled by this elected body of officials and two consuls. This arrangement and organization is feasible within a certain size. However, the empire is growing larger and larger, therefore the government could no longer enforce taxation and maintain order and the basic civil functions that it had promised before. Therefore, power is going to be located in the hands of fewer and fewer until only an emperor, not the Senate, will rule. This corresponds with a swelling of population by the 1st century BCE, where we find over 1 million people living in Rome. This is only made possible through the latest engineering technology, whereby we can bring in from hundreds of miles away fresh water on a daily basis through aqueduct systems. They have a rudimentary sewage system, and even the wealthiest members in Rome could afford to have water piped into their homes, something that we would not see again for over 2 millennia. Now, the vocabulary that we find in the United States, in the Capitol buildings, the White House, any of the justice halls, libraries, or otherwise that are built, are going to be taken from the vocabulary of imperial Rome. We, of course, intended to suggest that we built our country on the republican virtues that came before it, but the massive, impressive monuments really are dedicated to the imperial presence. Now, with the Ides of March 44 BCE, where we left off last time, a civil war follows, and that's going to be pitting the side that assassinates Julius Caesar with Mark Antony and Brutus against Julius Caesar's allies, including his grandnephew and his family, say Octavian. The civil war will last until 27 BCE. This is going to mark the outset and beginning of the Roman Empire. With the early empire and the Julio-Claudians, the families that were going to be ruling at this time in a dynasty passed down from father to son will rule until their death and the Flavians take over, and we will look up until 96 Common Era in this class today. The individual who would come out on top and would take over where his great uncle left off is Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, who was 19 years old at the time. For the next 17 years, he will vanquish opposition to bring peace to Rome and establish what is then called the Pax Augusta, or the Augustan peace. This prevails for 2 centuries and will become known as the Pax Romana because it moves beyond his reign. During this period, we find emperors are able to, because they are not in constant war, they're able to build roads, bridges, theaters, amphitheaters, bathing complexes all over Europe in their vast territory. They will use their great resources to mold public opinion into understanding and agreeing with their rule, as they are inheriting the right to rule from gods themselves now. In fact, it would be Octavian himself who would begin this trend, changing his name to Augustus, thus giving us the month August in our calendar today. He carries on where his great uncle left off as a great conqueror, for every emperor from now on must do 3 things to be great and respected and loved. One is to be a conqueror and to bring new territories under the flag of Rome. And we find that his territory was Egypt as he conquers Mark Antony, and Cleopatra commits suicide, willing the last Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt to him. Caesar, his great uncle, is going to conquer Gaul, and Vercingetorix, the great Gallic leader, thus bringing France under the control of ancient Rome. In 27 BCE, the Senate will bestow the title princeps upon him, or first citizen, making him what will later be known as a prince in Italian and Latin. However, that is not the extent to the importance of an emperor, for in 12 BCE, he is named Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, a title still held by the Pope in Vatican City today. This means that he is also responsible for appeasing the gods and sacrificing during high holidays. So he must be a spiritual leader as well. The final thing a Roman emperor must do to be popular is to mold public opinion by building public works projects, specifically those that benefit everyone, like amphitheaters and bathing complexes. Certainly, Augustus does this. Now, because we have a new type of ruler who is no longer defined by age, we have a new image to represent him. And so this will hold true more or less till the end of Rome, where we have a godlike leader who never ages, thus showing us that he is descended from the gods. This is illustrated very clearly, for in the lower left-hand corner here, we find that a tiny Cupid, or son of Venus, is going to point up and tug at Augustus. Here we find that the Julians are going to claim, the family that Augustus comes from, that they are the ancestors of Venus. Here we have Cupid down here reminding us not so subtly that these two men are going to be the same lineage. They both are sons of Venus. To reinforce this idea that the Julio-Claudians and Rome itself is founded by and descended from gods, we know that Augustus is going to commission Virgil, the great Roman poet, to write the Aeneid at this time. The Aeneid is going to pick up, importantly, where Homer's Iliad leaves off, showing us the great struggles of the Trojan peoples as the last prince Aeneas is going to take them to their new home and found Rome. Aeneas, importantly, is going to be the son of Anchises and the goddess Venus. Therefore, the Julio-Claudians trace their lineage back to Aeneas, this founder. Hence, they have a right to rule because they are part god.
As noted, Virgil writes in his Aeneid of the legend of Aeneas, who would eventually found Rome. He is the son of Anchises and Aphrodite, and is the cousin of Hector. Now, it is quite unusual for an ancient hero to have a divine mother instead of a divine father, all except for another very famous hero in the Iliad and in the Trojan War, Achilles. Now, we know that Poseidon saves Aeneas from Achilles in the Iliad, claiming that he will one day rule over the Trojans. Now, given that the Romans had no native origin stories themselves or explanations as to how they came to be, they borrowed an ancestor with a divine parent. Therefore, we find that the Aeneid begins with the foretelling of war between Carthage and Rome, placing the founding of Carthage simultaneous to the burning of Troy around 1200 BCE. Just as Juno would protect Carthage, so would Venus protect Rome. As in the Trojan War, different gods and goddesses took sides.
Here we find, if we compare the portrait Republican leaders to the new Roman emperor, that leadership is no longer defined by age. In fact, we often are going to move radically away from age to a more Greek understanding of idealization, because your power does not come from your experience, but the fact that you are in the lineage of a god. The same treatment is accorded to all the royal family, including his wife, which of course Roman emperors often were related to their wives, just like we looked at back in ancient Egypt. So them looking similarly is not surprising. But here we find the same type of Julio-Claudian idealization, where we find the high cheekbones, the narrow chin, the raised brow, the almond-shaped eyes, the sharp bridge of the nose, all of which are going to be similar in both figures, and including the small pursed lips. However, we know that this is not entirely fictional. It's not entirely idealized and or non-representational, because his chin is cleft, and that is going to be a very specific idiosyncratic marker of Augustan portraiture that we will look at later on when later emperors wish to compare themselves to him. On his cuirass, we are identifying Augustus as a general, hence this is often called the portrait of Augustus as general, because he is wearing a general's chest piece or breastplate, a cuirass. We discussed that last time with the Republican general. On these curiae, we often are going to find images that relate to what the wearer has done, what are their deeds, or what is their family lineage like. Here we are looking at the deed that Augustus carries out and the return of the standards. In 20 BCE, after he became emperor, he went on a diplomatic mission to the Parthians. With victory over them, they returned a standard that was stolen, or a military standard, which in this case is a staff with the eagle of Rome at the top. Here we find the Parthian wearing pants to the right, which of course the Romans thought was hilarious and of course was not a civilized way to dress, is going to be shown bearded, remember the Romans shaved, handing the standard to a Roman soldier or the personification of Roma, or Rome herself. Notice there is a she-wolf at the feet of that figure. Above, we have a celestial deity, or a sky god, who's going to be holding open a canopy of peace, as we find the chariot of Helios is driven across the sky, and then victories are going to be surrounding him because he is victorious. Below, we find the personification of the earth holds an overflowing cornucopia, showing us that prosperity is going to be made possible thanks to the peace that the Pax Augusta is going to bring, that Augustus brings peace. Thus, of course, it is better for everyone at this time living under Rome's protection. Now, if we compare this figure to earlier popular Greek works that were models for Roman athletes and were copied, again, in several examples that we know of, Polyclitus' Doryphorus is going to be the model for the pose here, specifically of the feet, for we note that Roman emperors often don't show themselves nude. They will show themselves in a particular military guise or in dress to show us that they are great military leaders, but we still want to relate back to the Greek Golden Age and the revival of Greek idealism, as of course he's going to be doing here by modeling himself after earlier works by Pericles and other patrons. If you look at the feet of the two figures, you see what Augustus and his sculptors have adopted from the Doryphorus, and that is the contrapposto pose, where all of the weight is distributed on the right leg, the engaged leg, while the left one is relaxed. However, as we just noted, he is not nude. The pose is going to be taken from the Arringatore, or Aula Metelle, the Etruscan full-standing bronze hollow cast that we looked at when we talked about Etruscan art. Here we find that the adlocutio pose, which is an oratorial pose where he's addressing a crowd. So just like the Arringatore, Augustus is here as a model for later emperors talking to us. This is set up in the middle of a piazza or square. So he is addressing us as a godlike ruler. Just like late classical sculpture, we find that he is going to be interacting with us. We can walk around him, but he is talking to us. Therefore, we do not understand the sculpture passively, but instead Roman sculpture is going to adopt that pathos of late Greek art that seeks to engage theatrically with the figures around it. Therefore, Roman eclecticism, bringing together the Greek and Roman and Etruscan ideas of style, subject, and presentation, are used here brilliantly by Augustus in much of his works and much of his commissions as propaganda, showing us that he deserves to be the first emperor. And by and large, he is going to receive very little pushback or resistance from the populace. He is, in fact, a populist ruler. His popularity will spread throughout the empire as he will adopt the same strategies as his great uncle, coining, once again, in mints with this numismatic approach, putting his face on coins to ensure that across the vast empire, everyone knows who he is and what he has done. On the back, very often putting the monuments that he's commissioning that benefit, right, the populace at large. Now, what we must not forget is that these would have been polychromed or brightly painted. They would have been very graphic, and you could read them better at a distance. They, of course, are a bit jarring to modern audiences, but we need to keep this in mind regardless. Another monument commissioned by Augustus informs of his social policies at the time and records an inauguration event in 13 BCE. That is his era Pax Augusti, or the altar of Augustan peace, not so subtly reinforcing the fact that he is going to be the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, and because of him there is peace and prosperity. Because of him the gods favor the Romans. It was commissioned on his return from Gaul and Hispania, or from France and Spain, as we now call the two countries. The monument would have been hypaethral, that being open to the sky, originally in the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars, whereby you would walk up into, the emperor would, we might add, into this great altar, where there is another altar on which you would sacrifice.
Originally, the Areopagus Augusti sat in the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars, where the Roman army would practice exercises and where war is declared. It is here that we have a sundial that is set up with an indicator from an Egyptian obelisk taken from Heliopolis, brought back to Rome by Augustus himself. It symbolizes the vast shadow that Rome cast over the world, as we have an object that's taken from a faraway land and now is used to illustrate Roman power. This is also significant because it relates the patron deity, Apollo himself, who is the sun god, to Augustus, for this aligns with his doorway on Augustus's birthday. It is Rehak who argues that the two equinoxes in March and September also align with the birthdays of Augustus, Romulus, and Numa, other very famous Roman predecessors to Augustus, thus tying himself to the founder of Rome and early important rulers of Rome. Now, the three founders are brought together here in this one monument. The flower garlands seen around the Areopagus Augusti, hanging from ox skulls, relate to the sacrificial offerings that are given during the annual commemorations, with the flowers for continuing peace during the Pax Augusta. These are going to be taken from other temples, in turn divined from Greek tholos temples, where we also see these ox heads and garlands. For the garlands or flowers, the promise of new life and fertility, while the ox heads, the sacrifice that is required to get them. In fact, Kleiner notes that the structure itself is modeled after the Parthenon's altar of the 12 gods. So we find that here we have a structure that we enter, and there would have been an additional altar.
Now, celebrating the Pax Augusta, we have relief sculptures around the Areopagus Augusti that are going to record Augustus's lineage, and the Julio-Claudian's lineage for that matter, as well as recording an inaugural ceremony of 13 BCE. On the images that flank the main doorway as we walk up into this altar, we notice there are going to be portraits of Aeneas, the son of Venus and Augustus's forefather. We know that he is going to flee the burning city of Troy and will take his people to establish a new Rome, a new Troy, we should say, here in Rome. And he's told to follow a pregnant sow or pig until it lays down and gives birth. And that's where he knows where to found this new city, this new civilization. So you see, once again, the sow here in the lower left-hand corner. So Virgil is going to be the great Roman poet commissioned to glorify the Augustan tradition and the Julio-Claudians by writing the Aeneid that records the founding of the Julian line. So we find here, we move back to this idea that he is a god, therefore he is going to be given a privileged position in the civilization.
Again, Rehack would argue that we should note that the sacrifice here does not match the visual traditions or textual antecedents. And in fact, we're not actually looking at Aeneas, and instead argues that we are looking at Numa, who is the second king of Rome and the lawgiver. He also founded the Temple of Janus, which is the indicator of war and peace. For when war is declared, the Temple of Janus opens its doors. Now, this temple was also in the Campus Martius and is part of the declaration of war and the ceremony associated with it. The Vitales, the priestly college, in other words, oversaw the declarations of war. They would seal peace after war is concluded by sacrificing a sow or a pig. Octavian revived this tradition for the Battle of Actium, where he attacked the foreign Mark Antony, who had aligned himself with Egypt and Cleopatra. The relief here, thus Rehack argues, is going to show Numa sacrificing a sow with a foreign king to guarantee peace, thus alluding to the Augustan peace, bringing together the allusion in Book 6 by Virgil of this poetic vision of Rome's future, with Aeneas, then Romulus, Numa, and now Augustus.
Now, the fruits of the Pax Augusta, or the Augustan peace, are going to be very clearly laid out and spelled out in the reliefs alongside the structure, where we find personifications or allegories of the earth, the sky, the seas, are going to be shown here as women seated on birds, on dragons, or kitos, as they are called at the time, sea monsters in the lower right-hand corner here, or these various creatures on land, a bull, a sheep, and then what will become the symbol for Roman charity, a woman holding two children. Generally breastfeeding them is how it is shown, but we find that everyone is peacefully engaged with everything else, that the elements are in balance, no one is fighting, the creatures are not eating one another, and this is the result of Augustus and what he brought to the world. Now, recording the ceremony in 13 BCE that makes Augustus the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, we see here recognizable contemporary figures and, for the first time in a Roman monument, children. So this is going to relate to the golden age of Augustus, to that of Pericles in Athens, that we find here that the procession would remind us of the Panatheanic festival procession frieze, where Athenians are walking across the Pantheon, recording the event that takes place every 4 years. Here, we find we have a specific event, though, not one that recurs again and again, but one in which we find the Roman emperor's duties are going to be greatly expanded and refined. Now, the children that exist here are very interesting because this is the first time we see them on Greek or Roman state monuments. They are not on the Parthenon, for instance. They also behave like children. They are restless. They talk to one another. They fidget, right? So there's an anecdotal approach to this and a specificity which is touching and yet at the same time very significant and believable. Now, this relates to Augustus's social policy that is going to try to combat the declining birth rate among nobles. He's trying to promote marriage, marital fidelity, and the raising of children. The same argument is going to be made in nearly every civilization when there is another populace that is rising ethnically to replace the dominant one. So here we find Augustus is already fearful that the dominant families in Rome are declining. Now, this is supposed to be a moral exemplar, that men should be with their families, here with their wives, with their children, not out at symposia or not at orgies, not at these grand banquets, but should be good husbands at home.
Before moving on, it is important to note, as Kleiner has argued, that this was inspired by, and in turn inspired itself, further and future funerary stelae, where we often find men, women, and their children together. There are, in fact, no other examples of children or families outside of these funerary markers.
So this relates to a massive propaganda campaign by Augustus that we saw a moment ago in the sculpture. Here we see both his political and his social agendas to establish himself as this godlike ruler descended from a goddess, but also to record what people should be doing at this time in his Rome.
The most ambitious project undertaken by Augustus is going to be found in his Forum, and it has the most extensive use of marble, one that would equal Periclean Athens and the Acropolis. It explicitly references, in fact, the classical age of Athens and the Acropolis. Here we have the Forum of Augustus, which is right next to the Forum of Trajan later on as it was built. And the structure, which is going to have dual apses and a temple to Augustus, is going to be in the downtown heart of Rome in the Forum Romanum. Now, to understand what the temple to the deified Augustus would have looked like, we need to look at the Maison Carrée, or the square house in Nîmes, France, which could have been built by the same architects around 10 Common Era. In it, we have a pseudo-peripteral temple that has one entryway on the front like the Pax Augusti, with engaged columns on the other 3 sides. Now, this is a Corinthian pseudo-peripteral temple, for we have Corinthian capitals. Thus, we are referencing Augustan neoclassical architecture here that looks back to not only Golden Age Greece, but the Republican Age. The engaged columns, again, are like Republican architecture, but the numerical relationships approximate that of ancient Greece, thus making it neoclassical, or reviving classicism, or the approach to classical balance, symmetry, and mathematics in ancient Greece. Thus, it is going to equal the mathematical equation 2x plus 1 equals y. Now, Augustus, in the Pax Augusta, is going to have many building campaigns, not the least of which is completing a series of aqueducts that had been begun earlier, since the 4th century BCE, spreading the notion of Roman ways of life to its colonies outside the peninsula. Here we have in France, at Nîmes, the Pont du Gard, where you can see the use of Roman arches, which would transport water thousands of miles across all of Europe. In this instance, we find that the Pont du Gard is going to distribute 100 gallons of water per inhabitant of Nîmes from 30 miles away, and is gravity-fed continuously on this decline, meaning that they had to ensure that it was tall enough at the source to feed the water being pulled down by gravity until it reached its final destination. Here we have large arches with an 82-foot span. Each block and the base is 2 tons each. We find there is a quickening rhythm with these harmonious proportions that reveal the aesthetic and practical sensibilities of Roman architects, and how they saved on materials with a very strong design of the arch. Now, the Julio-Claudian dynasty is going to be followed with Augustus, with Tiberius, who is the adopted son of Augustus, then Caligula, who's the son of Germanicus, Claudius, who is the brother of Germanicus, and finally Nero, who is the adopted son of Claudius and the last in the Julio-Claudian line. Now, it would be Nero and his extravagant behavior, much like Caligula before him, that would draw unneeded and unwanted attention that eventually leads to his death. It would be in 64 Common Era, when a great fire destroys Rome, that Nero was blamed. He himself blames it on a new religious sect called the Christians. After this great fire that devastated Rome, new building codes were implemented requiring the widespread use of concrete. This did not stop Nero from claiming a large part of downtown Rome for himself, in which he also used the new building technique and material of concrete. In it, we find a private pleasure palace near the Forum Romanum, where the modern-day Colosseum sits. The original structure which the Colosseum is over would have been a man-made lake. The palace just behind it, and Palatine Hill, where the imperial residences had been situated from about 30 BCE, is going to be just behind. The royal estate would have been expansive and would have included gardens with exotic animals for the emperor. All of this, of course, private in an area which was for the public. The so-called Domus Aurea, or Golden House of Nero, as it is named, designed by Severus and Calais, is going to explore the possibilities of concrete, with many different shapes, domes, entryways, and rooms that extend on for acres. This is where, in 1506, the Laocoon was unearthed under the supervision of Michelangelo. Now we find that this would be very influential for the Renaissance, and the High Renaissance would have been unthinkable without this discovery. Many of the rooms are actually going to be adorned in frescoes in the fourth style. Given the time period in which this is going to be built, it would be appropriate, showing the style that has all the previous three combined, with the faux expensive revetment, to illusionistic vignettes and scenes, to the rather fantastical framing devices. In it, we find a combination of the structure as a groin vault and a dome, where the walls and the vaults are not limited by space. And this is the earliest known concrete groin vaults that we have in ancient Rome. But the possibilities would now be explored further with a fenestrated sequence once we turn to more buildings in the Forum. It stays up with each one of these domes, not by way of an oculus, as the Pantheon will, but instead by corbelled stones in a relieving triangle if we look to Mycenaean domes. The triangle in these domes acts as an oculus relieving the pressure. But this is before concrete, obviously, with the Romans. Instead, the Roman domes are going to have an oculus or an eye in the center that relieves the weight, in this instance of an 8-sided and hemispherical dome with an oculus that admits light to the rooms and the adjoining rooms, and also it provides ventilation. This new approach to architecture means we have a new understanding of unified spatial interiors. So we can open up without supports what the ancient Mediterranean peoples and the Egyptians had wanted for millennia. Therefore, we are no longer limited to the rectilinear forms of the hypostyle hall in ancient Egypt and Karnak, nor the peripteral temples of the ancient Greeks. The malleability of concrete, in fact, allows for many new innovative forms. Unfortunately, the 14-year reign of Nero comes to a violent end because of his self-indulgent extravagance and his megalomania. He had, of course, his own mother executed and kicked his pregnant wife to death in a fit of rage. In 68 Common Era, because of this and many other crimes, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state and forced him to commit suicide with the help of a loyal slave before he was arrested and tried. This ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, leading to civil war. Now, we will pick up after you watch Engineering an Empire and the Great Feats of Augustus with the people that followed Nero and the Julio-Claudians, and that's going to be the Flavians, who were more practically minded and would engineer the Colosseum.